All right, thanks for the lead in. Hello, everyone, whether you're joining us here live or in YouTube land in the future. As was mentioned, my name is Emily, and I'm here to talk about game data pipeline, which is going to be, here we go. Like I mentioned earlier before the recording, fairly more abstract about the production process. I am not an engineer, but I work with a lot of engineers, so I've got a lot of insight into where we might have conflicts of interest between different disciplines, but and also how we can fix those conflicts. Because really, we're actually more in line with each other than it sometimes seems. So just a little quick bit about me. I graduated from RIT's MS program. I did the BSMS, so undergrad and grad, in at the GDD program. This was in 2022. I just feel so old thinking, man, that's like over 2 years ago. It's only going to get worse from here, I'm sure. So I've been working. I also, while I was there, was part of the Magic Maker program. You can see in the bottom right, one of the projects I'm probably most proud of, Boiling Over, which was like a coffee shop sim. That's really cute. At least I hope you think it is. So I've been a designer at Oxide Games, which is based in Baltimore, Maryland, for the last 2 years plus. I started out at associate level, and just over the course of the last 2 years and change, now I'm just considered a mid-level designer by the company. And yeah, through that time, I've worked on a lot of different projects, from like designing and describing feature sets, describing mechanics, writing like documentation, and also editing and authoring a crap ton of data. Um, like a crap ton. It's kind of crazy. Like big 4X games, you're talking like definitely not MMO level, but like you're approaching that. Depends on the MMO. um, at night, when I'm not too tired, um, I work on games personally. I've got several projects in the works. Really nothing professional, but I want to live that dream of making passion projects and all of that. And I genuinely just want to be awesome at game design in all aspects. I'm a learner, I'm a doer, and I just love making experiences, designing games, and I'm just going to keep going until I'm the very best ever, which will probably take forever, and I don't have that long, so I'll settle for being decent. Just like real quick, Oxide is currently working on the game Ara History Untold. We are working with Microsoft, who's the publisher, and we are actually launching this game in September 2024, which, hey, is like a month away. Um, uh, it's terrifying to say that out loud because we're still squashing as many bugs as possible and fixing everything to get it as perfect as possible for launch. So it's a grand strategy 4X game. Some people will call it a Civ-like, because a lot of some of the mechanics in the core are similar to Civ, which is many consider one of the earliest 4X games. But it has like the screenshot here kind of shows you really zoomed in on the world, but this is built using our custom Nitrous engine, which the stuff that it does with graphics and rendering and like performance is way above my knowledge as an engineer, to be honest. But it's really impressive. I really recommend checking out our website, checking out YouTube to see some of like the dev diaries and some of the other, just information about the game, because it's really cool to see all the work that's gone into it. And yeah, the engine is really cool in like how much it can do. Oxide has been around for about 10 years. Their first game was Ashes of the Singularity. I don't know if anyone's heard about it, but for a while it was actually used as like a really good benchmarking tool for graphics cards and PC builds, because it really like the whole point of I would say like the whole point of the engine is to like really make your computer and make your hardware work and like really get every bit of performance you can get out of it. And that focus has been on making really big games. Like Ashes has like literally a planet view, and you can like zoom in like in real time, like all the way down to like a battlefield. as it's, and as the whole thing is simulating. And it's like, it's pretty high fidelity for how big it is. So really cool stuff. I recommend you check us out. And check us out on Steam. Wishlist us on Steam, all that good stuff. So yeah, as I'm about to start this, I was kind of saying to some of the people earlier before the talk started, just like, I guess, disclaimers. One is that, I don't consider myself an authority. I consider myself a person who has, been in the proverbial trenches of working on game data for like a massive game that is being published by Microsoft, so it's a big game for a big company. I am someone who is more of a user of data and more of a user of just any tools that the engineers decide I get. But also, I want you to take all the lessons, all the insight and suggestions that I have here and apply it how you see fit in your projects and whatever you do. Not necessarily treat it like it's gospel. Similar to a GDC talk, right? It's someone's experience. It's probably very good wisdom, very good advice, and a good rule of thumb. But, there isn't one solution to any of the problems we're going to discuss here. And again, I am not an engineer. So I do admit there are going to be a few points where I'm like, and then here's where the engineers do their magic. I understand a lot of I'm more most of my engineering experience where I'm strongest, I would say, is more in like gameplay programming. So in terms of like writing and crunching algorithms and making a game work, I can do that, but I'm not the type of person who's going to write custom data types, a custom engine, custom graphics rendering, that sort of thing. And I also just really want to say that anything here that seems like it's negative or might hint at moments where development didn't go so smoothly, I just want to say that is no reflection on our studio or any of the people who work there. This is a complicated problem, and I think you'll see why. But I feel like it's a relatively complicated problem. There are a lot of things that seem like really good ideas, and in some cases will be really good ideas. But there's just, as you build a project, many people here will probably know, 6 months, 2 years into a project that goes on for years, things change a lot. The engine changes as it gets updated, your design specifications change, your way of working, even the employees and team members you have can change. And then when you're in the middle of development, you have deadlines, it can be really hard to pivot and try and like sit down and fix things that are more on the back end when really your publisher, especially, not just your publisher, bosses, whatever, it's like, man, we got to get the game working because we need a product to ship. So I'm not disparaging. There's no disparagement, no ill will, no nothing. I work with great people at Oxide and Microsoft. And this is just how it happens in the industry because we're always trying to work really hard to achieve awesome things. And sometimes that means having to put up with some non-awesome decisions that age poorly. That's just part of the industry. So the real quick primer here is, what is game data? What am I talking about when I say data? That's a very broad word. So data, from the player perspective, is what you see here. So it's all the stuff in the game, which is both the best description and worst possible description ever. I also like to think of it as the content of the game, your game has weapons. Well, every single weapon has a lot of data attached to it. It's got, I don't know if you can see the mouse here, but like it's got the name, it's got the art asset, it's got all kinds of stats, and it even has abilities, things like that dictate how it works in the game, how the player gets to interact with it, and how it interacts within the systems that the game, is running, the game has built. I also think of it like game pieces, right? Like if you think of, I don't know. I don't play Monopoly, but that was the first game that came to my mind. You can think of like a card as a game piece, Obviously, its functionality and how you use it and how you interact with it, that's all up here with you and, the people around you. But it still has, it represents something and it interacts with the game systems. It could be and it could be anything. It could be cards in a card game. It could be improvements in like a game where you're building buildings. It could be enemies. Honestly, even levels, I think would fit into this, but levels are really not. Levels are not something that I am super familiar with designing. Our game is very systemic, so we don't really like we have map generation, but we don't have like levels and like creating levels. So that is something that is a little bit out of scope for this presentation. I can't really speak to it, but you could consider a level data as well. And from like a user perspective, we're talking just this. So from like a design perspective, it's your spreadsheet, your notes or whatever that says, ooh, we're going to have an axe and it does this much damage, where it's this much gold. It's your scriptable objects in Unity, where you've defined a template saying this is what a weapon is. Here are all the things on the weapon, and here's where I can actually author every single weapon. So this is the area we are talking about here. So I'm going to talk about, so I say pipeline, and I emphasize like production pipeline, because realistically, data in the game is going to go through several steps. It's not like a one-to-one, like when you think of like a rendering pipeline, where it is, it's literally code and steps that you do in a code, or steps that you do within code. I'm thinking more from the perspective of how do you take your list of weapons in the game and turn it into, well, the weapons in the game. So I've identified, I think, 4 major steps. Honestly, like, there could be as many or as few in practice as you'd like. But I think that this sort of will capture the general problem space that will apply to the vast majority of projects. It might look a little different for every single project, on exactly how you interpret each of these is going to depend on the project and the team, but I think in general this is a good way of considering this problem. So the first step is designing data, and I would say the most funnest part. So obviously here I've given examples of like sort of some of the more like classic tools you might use. As I'm looking at this slide now, I'm seeing the PowerPoint logo, and I'm like, you could, but I don't know why you would. But this is, you're literally like saying, man, what are the events in our game? What are all of the things in our game? And obviously this is a very important step, because if you're sitting down, you're like, man, we're going to make this strategy game that lasts for like 100 turn or 500 turns, and you're making slide deck data. I mean, honestly, people do crazy things in PowerPoint. I wouldn't be surprised if someone has already tried that. But this is very important, because every single thing here needs like audio, video. It needs graphics. It needs visual effects. And it probably needs like a million other considerations too, like or like if it were cards, you need an image, you need sound effects, you need all this stuff. You need a plan ahead of time, because especially at scale, could be like literally like 6 months of work to get all of these buildings. And that's a lot of money if you're like a big studio. And if you're not a big studio and you're like one person, you're like 6 months is a lot of time to make any one thing. So this is a very important step. You also, obviously, from like a design and like balance perspective, you need to make sure that like the system that you've designed can actually like accept and work with a wide variety of interesting game pieces. So, I joke a lot that like games can literally just be in a spreadsheet and that's it. All the graphics and audio and whatnot, that's just fluff. You can just sit down and emulate it all in a spreadsheet. But obviously it's not really a fun game for most people. But yeah, so this is a very important step. And I would say is like step 1. Step 2 is authoring the data. So I say authoring and designing as 2 different steps, because man, the computer doesn't know what any of this is, right? It doesn't know what that is. It's like Excel, what? I don't get it. Your engine, whether you're in Unity or whatever, It can't read your notes. We know that. So there has to be some sort of conversion. And we're going to talk about what this sort of conversion actually can mean in practice. But there has to be some sort of conversion between what you've designed and what you intend to create in the game, and what the actual game readable data is. Like this is what I would call authored data. This is like data that is readable by your engine. It is data that can be used. It's not just me typing out pants $20. This is how we define pants or items in our game. And what it looks like is going to vary drastically. Again, we at Oxide, I won't go into too much detail. I honestly don't know how much detail I'm allowed to go into. But we do have a proprietary, or many proprietary, like data formats. What we use looks very similar, at least at a glance, to like a JSON file, or like, a bunch of like JSON objects in a big file. So I think that like if you're used to that sort of notation for your data, that's still pretty common. And it's something that someone who writes actually writes the gameplay programming, UI programming, etc., can actually iterate over. It's something the game can actually ingest. Speaking of ingesting, man, now I'm hungry. Ingesting, honestly, I could not find a better way to represent this. But I would say that ingesting from like an abstract point is how you take your readable data and turn it into something that can actually be worked on and used within the engine. So like obviously something like Unity, I don't have a good picture because something like Unity, right? If you took your scriptable objects, you have your scriptable object, but like the game can't do anything with that unless you explicitly say what you're gonna, or you explicitly program the behavior for reading all this, for reading it, for instantiating objects, for whatever. And again, that's why I kind of don't have an issue or a good image for this. So I just kind of looked around for stock images of people on computers, and I put the little scriptable objects there because that's what you need to ingest. Should have put a big mouth like devouring them. But the guy on the computer with the ski mask, that just entertained me to no end. And finally, you're going to get to the step where you can actually play with the data, which is where it comes alive in your game, in your engine. And I bring this up as a step in the pipeline because while, like, from some perspectives, what I just described, you might be like, oh, well, what do you mean? You're done. Like, no, we're game developers. The thing showing up on the screen is like the start of our job. There's still a lot more work to do here. And I think that this is also an equally important moment in the production of data, because this is where you're actually going to get to play with it. This is where you're actually going to see if it works. And there's still a lot of considerations for like what happens once the data is in your game, and like when you're able to start playing with it. So you'll see what I mean when we get to this point further in the presentation. So how do you create this? Again, so I'm coming at this from the perspective of making your time working on this game, creating data, and putting content into your game as smooth and seamless as possible. So, if you are, I'm not gonna tell you how to code Excel or how to write an engine. Please enjoy these Shutterstock stock images, by the way. But I want to give you like sort of guideposts that can be like your North Star as you are embarking on your journey, or maybe in the middle of the journey. So my general advice, and this can apply to like just your whole project, you need to figure out how you're going to have a data authority. So this is actually something that we run into, or that we have been running into a lot lately, is that when something in game looks wrong, like maybe something says plus 30, whatever it is, like it's a unit buff or something, and it says this unit gets plus 30 strength. The question is that a bug? Like you might look and say, plus 30 seems like a lot. And your QA team, or maybe even like just your teammates, or even you, but like 3 weeks after you wrote the data, there's like they don't know if that's correct. And this technically isn't a bug, is it? Like everything's working just fine. You need to know, like, is everything showing up in the game correctly? And you need to be able to communicate that with QA, with your teammates, publishers, stakeholders, etc. What values are unquestionably the correct values? And what's tricky is you might find multiple sources for this. Is what I'm seeing on the screen in game, is that correct? Is the data that like the game is reading, is that correct? Or is what I wrote in this spreadsheet 6 months ago, is that correct? What you need to do is figure out where authority lives within your data and within the production of the data. What do you look at as the source of truth? Next, you need to figure out, this is kind of like the real overarching challenge. It's like just one bullet point here. It's easy. No, decide how designed data becomes game readable data. So just to kind of quickly summarize, we're going to go more in depth into this because this is kind of like one of the biggest problems, I think. But to kind of go more in depth, just imagine like you have two people. One says, man, we need a guy with a sword. If the other person then, or if your artist sits down, your audio sits down, they make this guy with a sword, they make the sound effects and all of that. This is the process of you saying, here's what we need, here's how we make it happen. But the problem is, if you don't communicate this well, let's say you're just doing this really rudimentary example I set up, you don't communicate this well, you're not going to get what you asked for. Not only that, you might end up causing yourself and everyone else a lot more pain if you have like 100 units that you have to create, 100 units, 100 enemies or whatever. And you might sit down, you might be a designer, and you make this awesome list, but how does this translate to, does an engineer, does an artist, or whatever have to just look at the sheet and like just start typing? How does that actually scale when you have like literally hundreds of everything? We'll talk more about this problem when I get to the slides for it. And honestly, above all, you just need a plan and you need to talk with all the disciplines. Genuinely, some days, like half of my workday, I would say, goes to just answering questions. If you look at like honestly, a lot of like jobs for like game designers, one of the things they say is you have to evangelize the design of the game. You are like largely an information broker. I think that this creates a lot of information overhead, or I'm sorry, communication overhead, which can definitely like hinder everyone's ability to get things done. But you really need to figure out with your team, with all the stakeholders, just what everything actually means. What does it mean to have like what is like your improvement, your buildings in the game? What do they actually need? What is all of the data that's going to be associated with them? If I say we need a cobbler that makes shoes in the game, who do I need to tell? What's the process for getting all of that out there so that everyone knows, okay, we're making a cobbler. I'm making the sounds of a guy hitting a shoe with a hammer. I'm making the art of, the icon of a guy hitting a shoe with a hammer. And honestly, that just kind of dips into good production practices in general. So looking at the first step, I kind of wish I had like a diagram for like all the steps, but the first step would be the designing of data. It seems like it's going to be very easy, but it's not, because as I mentioned earlier, this can be where a lot of people look for their source of truth, like what was originally designed. So you might think, oh yeah, this is just data, we'll just put it down, whatever. This might end up being something that a lot of people have to look at. And if it's not well maintained, well organized, things can go sideways really fast. So what I would really suggest is figure out what the relationship is between designed data and game readable data. You might decide on your project that there is no difference. If you design the data, you don't write it in a spreadsheet or in whatever program you want, PowerPoint. You just say, here's the data file, here's the JSON, here's the whatever. write your data right here in this format, and we're good to go. I don't know that that is actually a good idea. There are some benefits to that. However, if you have a very systemic game that really cares about balance and you're really working with a big swath of data, you are going to want it in a very like human readable format. Now, I'm not saying that we can't read code, but if I have like, let me just go, can I go back? Yeah. Um, there was a slide. I had to go back a while for that. If you have like something like this, where you just have this data laid out in a spreadsheet, you can very easily filter it. You can very easily search, and you can see just like hundreds, literally hundreds of pieces of game content all at once. You can even like very easily find just the information you want by hiding columns, etc. But if you just have a file with like we literally have files that are like 50,000 lines of just nothing but this. Good luck if you have to perform a really big edit. Obviously there's Control F, but it is like it's like trying to find like a bird or like trying to go bird watching, but like you just hold the binoculars to your face and you're just like looking around. It is extremely inefficient for editing, and actually like reading and seeing all of the data. Um, so I would strongly recommend not doing that. But you're going to need to, but you're going to need to define what exactly you are doing with the designed data. You might say that the design data is just notes or like general, like whatever, and you say that the authored data that's actually readable by the game is your source of truth. You could do that. Um, and then have your, obviously you would have to like manually or set up some sort of tool chain where Excel or whatever you're keeping like design in updates automatically. You could also theoretically create your own custom data browser, which we actually have. However, the UI UX, the way it was designed was actually for artists. So I could actually we have a custom data browser. I could open up any one given building or whatever, but that's it. I can only see one at a time. It's so many clicks, so many like operations to just get to where I want to go. Um, so it's a fairly inefficient way of working unless you've designed or planned ahead of time and actually made a tool. Which honestly seems like it could be a really fun project. Um, a lot of designers like Word, they like Excel. They should. I'm not going to say they should like them less, but I'm going to say that as we continue, you'll see like where problems come in. Um, but if you could hypothetically have a way to like present your game data in a very like readable and like filterable format, like by just reading the literal data and displaying it on screen, that would be awesome. One thing that our team was working on, we actually had at least one engineer who, when he saw our old way of working, which I'll get to very shortly, he personally was like, no, we need to write like better tooling for you guys. And he did. But as that continued, we ran into other problems with the tooling and with our process. Um, and um, we had sort of like last left off at saying, what if we just made Excel like able to read our game's data? We could have the game data as the authority, and then Excel, which is like very feature rich in terms of like formatting and like searching and like filtering all that stuff. It already has all that. We don't need someone to code that. We just need some way to make these two talk. Oh man, we're getting way later than I thought. Okay, I'm gonna need to hurry this up. Um, so sorry, where was I? I mentioned keep anything and everything programmery out of your design space. I don't think it's necessarily the worst thing in the world, but the issue is that you're starting to have like conflicting concerns here, and if you're trying to like format your design data so that it's like more similar to the game's data, you basically have two interests and you're getting the worst of both worlds. I think the next slide actually, yeah, the next slide. Okay. We're going to get into that. The other thing is I really hope that everyone can find ways to enforce consistency, and you can do this very even in your design documents, because otherwise there's going to be a lot that's not fun. What I mean by this is take a look at this example, which you saw earlier. I literally didn't try this, didn't mean to do this, but I literally wrote different words for the same thing in multiple spots, different pluralities. Whereas if you literally just take a moment to say, even in my data, I'm going to say, here's the source of truth. Here are all of the items. If you want an item in something, you get a drop down. And we have a valid list of data because we've agreed we want the bread, corn, and wheat in the game. You could also do something very similar with enums. You could say, man, how many items are in the game? 50? Okay, well, here's an enum with like 50, 50 different options. Now you can't say breads or like corns. I don't know. That isn't the best example because I don't think you'd pluralize bread like that. But there is no room for being inconsistent. Similar to this, there are a lot of times where you might think that you're doing this, but you're not. We have, because our game is going to be actually being translated right now into plenty of languages, at least for being released, everywhere. We have text keys, and all the text keys are basically containers for actual text. So that we can say, here's this menu, display the text that is in this text key, and then the localization manager will like figure that out and put in the correct text based on what localization you're playing in. But the problem is that the way we've set this up, these names are literally just strings. Like, sure, if you look, these are actually in an XML file. You'll see like the XML and you might think, okay, cool, unquestionably, this is the item name for our tools item. But like, there's no enforcement of that, right? So you can end up with duplicated text because there's no enforcement of how you format names or like what the names are formatting, or whether it's description first or the item first. And genuinely, like you saw in the previous example, I could write tools and then the next time write tool. And before I know it, if I miss that, imagine like a year later where there's like a billion references in all of your data to this string that's inconsistent, and you get, it's not necessarily like the end of the world in every case, but it's going to make text editing so much more painful because you're like, I don't know what it's called. Whereas if you have something like enums or just some other like enforcement of what is valid, you don't need to memorize, you don't need to guess. You don't want to be working with the recipes and you're like, well, what did we call this item ID? Oh, was it plural? Was it singular? No, you don't want to mess with that. That is just a waste of your time and it's going to cause a lot of errors. Which is kind of the same point here is that like, we literally have an item that's called farm tools, but in game it's undergone like maybe like 4 different names, but we're still just calling it farm tools. In data. Again, if you're like sitting down and you're in a different area of your data or you're like trying to like access this, you either have to like have like literally hundreds of names of things memorized or spend all of your time for who knows how many like actual things you're iterating through, looking it up to make sure you're putting in the thing, and then running the game and then it telling you that you typoed it or something. So you really want to, and again, this is the sort of thing that you think, man, the game's going to say there can only be like one identifier of this. At the end of the day, the way it ended up being implemented, these were more or less just glorified strings. So that is like definitely a pain point that I think, consider how you're going to enforce consistency. That's the main bullet point that I want you to take away from here. Yeah, so I mentioned picking or creating tools that are going to make editing easy. There are a few tools out there that are like sort of general purpose. I don't know what you want to call it, like data editing. So like if you think of like Unity, I think that Unity's scriptable objects is like an extremely powerful example of how you can make template data like this. Like you can define, like it's so easy to just write the definition. You essentially write what is more or less a schema, And then you just create the objects. You create create it in them through the Unity like creation asset creation menu, whatever they call it. And then you edit it. It's that easy. I think it's one of the best examples. If you're not using Unity, I think Unreal has something similar. I only used Unreal a little bit, so I don't remember all the specifics. But I think that's really just I think that's a really good example to base that off of. And if like I had a tool like that to like author data and like edit data, oh, my job would be so much easier. um okay, enough gushing about scriptable objects. These other things, look, everyone knows these, but no one follows them. Name your files meaningfully, name your data meaningfully. There was a while when we were exporting data from spreadsheets and all the files were like items 1, items 2, etc., which was sort of fine for a while because we were editing in the spreadsheets, but now we're not doing that anymore for various reasons. I'm not going to get into it. We are literally just editing our game's data files, which sucks when you have like 6 files that are named like buffs 0, buffs 1, buffs 2, buffs 3. It's like, which file do I need to actually check out and work on and commit? There's no enforcement of organization anywhere because it's just a bunch of data in a file. Literally, I just said one day, okay, screw it, man. And I found every single buff that was related to like game, like story events, basically. And I said, new file, event buffs, move them all in there. Someday, when we're not trying to squash bugs to ship a game, I will probably actually rename and resort everything. But I haven't done it yet. And naming your data itself, that is also that it's just such an uphill battle because you have to consider, like in the example I gave earlier, if it's tools, well, what happens when you rename it? Do you want to give it like a generic name? Do you want to say like tools level 1, tools level 2? Or, do you even want there to be a difference between the name and the actual text that's displayed on screen? That's how it works in our game, like I said, because of translation. But maybe there's like a better way you could do that. Instead of having, one thing that I sort of the engineer I've worked with who really wants to give us better tooling has sort of said we need to make the code and the machine do the work. So there's just so many so many instances where we have, like, I need to say, okay, well, what's the name key for this identifier? What's the what's the recipe for this identifier? What's, all this stuff? What's the asset for this identifier? And this is all just stuff we have to end up manually typing into data. Like, it's doable, and first world privilege having to type stuff in on a computer all day, like, oh, boo-hoo. But when we're talking like person hours on a project that has a deadline, you're wasting so much time having to like put in all of this data manually. I would really strongly recommend like making sure that, like, I'm kind of skipping ahead because like this is, I think, in the next set of slides. Make the engine do the work. Try to have as little translations or as little like things where I have to put in, okay, this is the item, I have to put item name, and this is item recipe. Why not just find a way to say, this is the item ID, search for this data. I will expect it in this format, or like, do some sort of fuzzy search. I don't know. But that would just save everyone so much time. The other thing is document your tools and your processes. This documentation is like the thing everyone says, this is stupid. Why would we do this? Well, we recently enlisted a bunch of new folks from various partner studios to help us, and no one knows how anything works. If only we had a document for it. And before, when we were using the exporter, so many engineers would be like, man, is it okay to edit this data? I don't know. Here, Emily, you do this, because I don't know how to do the process. To be fair, we did have data. They just didn't want to read the document. But you want your tools to be usable by the whole team, and documented for anyone new. I know documentation is the last thing anyone wants to do, but you gotta do it. Just kind of giving some example of some of the nightmares that we've had to do with data authoring. So for a while, we were actually exporting data from Excel spreadsheets which is not the worst idea in the world, but a lot of people like sort of involuntarily gag when they hear that, and there's a good reason they would gag. But for a while, we literally were using an exporter that took the text and just pasted it in a file. So we had to write like when we had basically what we would do is we would have an Excel sheet. One sheet would have like all of the data that's just human. I say human readable. I don't mean to be offensive to engineers. Just like it doesn't have all this crap that computers like. And then what we did was we wrote the most hideous functions you could ever imagine in your entire life to format it into something that when the exporter would take this text and put it into the file, it wouldn't, the engine wouldn't barf all over itself. So we eventually did get rid of that, and I learned a lot about making Excel better. So we had an export process that we really didn't have to worry, one, about all this formatting, because it's also a nightmare if you have like a million things like this, and then you change your data format and how the data gets read, and you have to edit a million things like this and be careful not to break literally everything because you missed a parenthesis. Yeah, I'm speaking from experience. Instead, we sort of had like this middleman sheet that we did. So we had data that looked like this, and then we would have like a translation sheet that would just sort of do, it would just take it and take whatever the data was, find it, move it into the columns, and then the exporter would just look at that. And the exporter, this is part of where my gaps in knowledge. I don't know how it does it, but it more or less says, I know how our data is formatted. I can turn this is what I expect. I expected an integer here. I expected a string here. I expected blah, blah, blah here. I can just do it. Make the machine work. And for the love of God, if you are using Excel or Google Sheets, do not ever use the index match functions. I don't know if this actually means anything to anyone. XLOOKUP and tables lets you put things into a nice table, name the column of the table, use XLOOKUP to say, look in this column in this table, look in this table in this column, cross-reference it, and give me the result here. Don't ever use index match because it is the devil. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you are lucky. So let's see. Ingestion advice. So this is probably where I have the least useful information to give because I am not an engineer, but I'm going to do my absolute best. First off, validate your data. That's very important, but you need to do so meaningfully. I'm going to skip to the next step and ask you how helpful any of these messages actually are. And this kind of gets into like the derived data. This literally, like, go ahead, read like 2-3 of them, and realize that like what seems like it's helpful is actually not. It's literally just the computer complaining to you that it doesn't like the thing you gave it. Now, at one point, I would say that there was a reason we had, if we had an improvement and it could craft items, it would have a flag that said like crafter. But like, why? Right? Like, tell me why. Like, realistically, why can the CPP file not just derive this information? Now, there is sort of the counter argument here that what if you accidentally put a recipe in an improvement and now the game thinks it can craft, so it pulls up the crafting UI whenever you open up the. Okay, well, I'll open it up and see it in the game and I'll fix it. Like, I don't know. This sort of thing does not actually help all that much. And all of this information, so much of this can just be derived by the CPP. Rather than saying, hey, designers, you need to like arrange everything perfectly in order for. No. It can't decide that it's a crafter because you put recipes in it. You need to also explicitly tell it it's a crafter. Find ways to not do that. So make meaningful, valid data. So like, is something missing? Is there a typo? Realistically, if you follow the ideas of enforcing consistency and like enforcing data, or enforcing, things to be named correctly. What's I gonna say? You probably don't have to worry about this so much because literally you can kill this at the spot. If I'm the designer and my tool or whatever, you gave me a tool, and it is presenting me with a drop down of like references to other data, I can't possibly make a typo. I can't possibly put in something that doesn't exist. You have made your tool and you have made your data idiot proof. You don't even need to put in these strings because you know that at the point of data creation, it's going to be fine. The last part here is going to say kill all references to references to references. This sort of goes hand in hand with like this bit with like we for a very long time, and I guess still to this day, it's very difficult to delete one thing in the game because you then have to find like 6 other pieces of data and delete the references to that data. And sometimes you will have references to the data that like also has this it's kind of hard to explain. Like, I wish I had actually made a visual for it. But it was a nightmare to delete just one single thing because deleting one thing didn't mean that it stopped existing elsewhere. Which is why I say that, like, a source of authority that says, here are all the items, and you're like, this is no longer a valid item. Obviously, I would have to go and do the cleanup, but I would actually know, like, immediately where all the cleanup was, because I'd be getting the errors right there. Instead of having to run the engine and having to run the, having it crash on me or having it throw, like, one of these asserts, I go and fix it. And then it throws another these asserts. And I thought I fixed it all, but I missed one of them. So I get one of these messages. We're running out of time here, so we're going to have to speed up a little bit. Play advice. So again, like I said, playing once your data is in the game, in engine, it's on the screen, you're still not done. Because, well, where is your data? Where is it in the game? Do you have, like, I don't know, do you have, let's say, a card game like Balatro or Slay the Spire? You have, like, a set of 300 cards. Well, but they only spawn randomly and with different chances. How do you know that you have this data? How do you know that it is loaded into the game? I know this might seem obvious, but there are so many moments where we have ended up not having certain things. Like, we have a system where, like, we can, like, place a lot of things, just buildings, units, we can grant ourselves a lot of things, but there are just these tiny things that, like, ended up falling to the wayside. Like, we never actually had a way to grant ourselves religious verses in our debug tools. Which means that the only way to actually test if your data is working in the game is to sit there and reload the game and try to engineer, like, use the existing debugging tools to, like, engineer this situation where you're going to get, like, 6 of the things, and you're like, okay, cool, this reload is save, and I'll get 6 rolls at once. Like, no! You need to prioritize being able to see anything and everything in your game. I would say before you even start making the game and making the way that you actually want the data to be used in there, you need to, like, be able to show me the data in the game. And you're going to want to be able to search. So you're going to need to, like, create some sort of UI, whether it's debug or maybe it's part of your game's UI. I say get your UI implemented early because, like, if you have a build menu where it shows you all the things you can build, well, you don't really need a debug tool, do you? You can just work on a part of the game that you needed to work on anyway, and now you can test that all of your data is appearing as expected. You've killed 2 birds with 1 stone, or there's a version where you don't kill the birds. If it's like a more, like, friendly PETA version of that. So if anyone knows that, please post that, because now it's bothering me that I don't know what it is. Feed 2 birds with 1 scone, thank you. But yeah, so you need to be able to see the data in-game, edit the data in-game, play with the data in-game. That needs to be, like, priority 1. Like, seriously, it is so important to saving yourself time down the line. Prioritize this, like, above almost everything else. Debug tooling is a godsend. Do I have anything? No, I don't have anything else. I did have another thought that I wanted to bring up that related to play and when the data is actually in the game, but it's not coming to me, and we're out of time. So, yeah, that was me venting. I got a little ranty in a couple of spots there, but mainly because I had some pretty bad days at work a couple of times. Again, seriously, working at my job, I know I complained a bit, but I'm complaining because this is something that you can run into on any project at any studio, even when everyone is really smart and has the best intentions. I'm really hoping that this has made you think about how you and or your team actually communicate and turn ideas and design into reality, and where maybe you have experienced some of these painful points. Whether you're starting on a project or working on one, I really hope that at least some of this has given you some insight into ways you can make the production pipeline um, a lot less terrible and miserable, because you want to spend your time working on the game and making the game awesome, not fighting a creature of your own of your own making. So thank you, everybody. um, that is all I had to say. If you have any extra questions or any additional questions, whether it be, I mean, preferably about what we talked about or about, I don't know, anything else, please feel free to post them. You can also, I'm in the Rock Game Dev server. You can send me a DM. You can tag me. I don't care. I'll get to you when I get to you, but I will get to you. Thanks for hanging out on this when I almost said Thursday. I'm time traveling. Thanks for hanging out with me on this Wednesday evening. I hope you had fun and learned a thing or two.